Thank you for tuning in to Circling into D-Logos and my conversation with Daniel Zaruba. So more about the conversation with Daniel in a moment. First, some housekeeping. So as of the date that I'm recording this, there is I think 1 or 2 spots left in the Art of Circling course, which we do once a year, which is the practitioner training to learn how to lead and facilitate circling. If you are interested in that, I would act pretty quickly. The links for that are below. It's a phenomenal experience. It happens once a year. The cohort closes once we start, which is going to be October 10th of this year. So in basically a week from now. And we have other events. We have open circling nights on Thursday evenings, 6 to 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And we also have weekend events about every 4 to 6 weeks. I also work with people one-on-one, and I'm currently taking clients. If you are interested in doing that, please email me at guysengstock@gmail.com and let me know that you're interested in that, and then we'll set up a appointment to talk about it. All right. So in this conversation with Daniel, which such a pleasure talking with Daniel, we get into some pretty deep things. I mean, we talk about a lot of different things. One of the main things is going into this notion of I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, a colloquy, which is, it's a distinction or a sense of a way of interacting that I would say is something like other than dialogue, something different than dialogue, a different kind of gathering that's distinct from logos. I don't know if you call that beyond or other than or trans dialogue. I'm not exactly sure how to put it, but it's fascinating, and it's based off of a work of Ivo de Janeiro, who is writing about the dialogue that the Japanese philosopher Heidegger had. And it's going kind of deep, and what I really like about that writing in this conversation is it's opening something up that's from a different vantage point than where we normally look with the way that we normally look at dialogue itself. So we talk about that and many other things, as Daniel and I often do, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. So we were just started to talk. We already started to get into it, but just to catch everyone up, we were talking about, you were saying, for you, Daniel, you're going to, the next phase in your training as a therapist where you are, you're going to start working with teenagers and their parents and stuff like that. And I was talking about for me, working with families and specifically the teenagers has been one of the most challenging places to work with, because there's so many dynamics that you're working with, right? And and then we were saying about in some ways, with the advent of the nuclear family, right, where you have a parent where it's like one layer of the parents, right, stands between the child and the world, right, and therefore the parent has to be the backbone that protects the child, right, but also has to have resourcefulness to deal with the child. And then if the child's like a troubled child, right, there's this, it sets up for this kind of constant exhaustion or this lack of resourcefulness, right? Then the parent kind of digs into these kind of like, kind of weird, inauthentic ways of talking, right? Authoritative ways of talking that the teenager just sees right through, right? And 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 so working with that, with that population, if you want to call it that, like has been for me has been one of the most challenging, and has called forth more creativity on my part to how to deal with that. And in some sense, that whereas that's the modern situation for many people, right? But if you go back in time, you more had the sense of like with there was the parents and the child, and then behind the parents were like the grandparents and the aunts and the uncles, and oftentimes they lived close together, right? And behind that was the church, right? And behind that was the tradition of the church. And so I would imagine in some senses that the parents like just didn't have the world behind them, but they had these layers, right? That could kind of hold them up in the face to be able to deal with the child in some sense. And the most of that for most people is gone. It's really, really gone. And I was like, and then I said, the thing I realized, like, yeah, that's what right there is one of the most primary examples that puts you right in the meaning crisis. That situation right there.
100% agree. I just wanted to say, kind of just as an addition, um, I talked about this with my girlfriend not so long ago, and I think I said something like that. When you have a lot of family members, aunts, uncles, but also brothers and sisters, let's say, when there were still very big families where you had a lot of siblings and not just one or two, or I mean, now I think in Asia or so, also in Europe, I think there's just single child families, and
Yeah.
that's also growing up without a sibling. That also shapes you, I think, very strongly. I often see this with my family because my father doesn't have any siblings, and he's just much more in his own world. While my mom is accustomed to having older brothers. So.
Mm.
But every person, I would say, is a world. And every person and every child that can kind of freely navigate in that I don't know, with all those worlds, and then when it can freely navigate, it can also pick, oh, I'm curious now about, I don't know, philosophy, and I asked my uncle Daniel to tell me about Heidegger and the Greeks or something like that. Or I want to go to aunt whatever and hear more about see how, and she tells me about gardening. Or, I don't know.
Yeah.
But when that collapses, and now we have this, and when a child is interested in something, I go on YouTube and look it up.
Yeah.
But that's such a different access to the world because it's always mediated through technology or through the screen.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know, with TV or smartphone.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is a radical reshaping of the world.
Right.
And it's
Right.
also it alienates you more from, let's say, the family and the place where you are actually
Yes.
living at. But
Yes.
it dislocates yourself and your identity and puts you into the cyberspace, the web, where also the way we create identity and we do all of this is very different.
Yeah.
So
Totally. Yeah. And that sense of, yeah, that sense that the answer is immediately accessible to you, right? Right. Having that right there
yeah,
is strange. It's a strange sense. In fact, it's funny that you mentioned this because I just went back to I moved out of the city a number of months ago, and I just went back this last weekend to visit people and stuff like that. And I stayed most of the time with a really good friend of mine who I'd known for years, who had lived in the Bay Area for the last 50 years. And but I started to notice what he started to do is like when we get in the car and we're going someplace that he'd been there, I don't know, 1,000 times, and he would like put his GPS on. And I started noticing, I'm like, what? Why are you putting your GPS now? Don't you know how to get there? And he's like, well, I didn't even think of that. I forgot I knew how to get there, right? And
Wow.
in what was striking about that, like and this is kind of seeing that now from this frame conversation is it's like it's not even it's not even that we go to that because that there's a missing. We just go to that, right? We just do the GPS because that's what you do when you drive the car, right? And of course, you do that for a while. A lot of people talk about this that they move someplace and they use the GPS and they don't actually know how to get anywhere without it, right? Because they haven't had to go through the embodied, embedded, right, enactment of what it takes to get to know the shape of a place, right, and to know where you are. And it does all of that. Yeah, it's so interesting to think about that. So interesting to think about that. Yeah, this is actually why Brienne and I have just really decided to not raise him on screens. I don't know how long we're going to be able to do that for, right? But it was so because we were letting him like watch these kind of educational things, which he was getting educated in the strange way at an early age. He was learning like how to count and all this kind of stuff. There were benefits to it. But we started to notice that afterwards, when we would like shut it off, he was like a monster. Like he was like a little tyrant, right? And he's normally not like that. And we both were like, I don't know what that thing is that he just becomes, but that's not the one I like. Right. So we just eliminated it, right, from his his options, right? And so I think we're going to stick with that as long as we possibly can. Because that there's something about, especially like a little baby, right, is just so vulnerable to whatever's going on the screen that like that I would just imagine most kids are being literally in some sense raised by that screen in so many ways, right? So it's really interesting. Hey, I was going to ask you, did you have a chance to read any of that Rosen book?
I I read the beginning, then I skipped a few chapters and went right to the end,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
like the last 2 or 3 chapters because it was about Plato and Heidegger.
yeah,
Um, do we now segue into this?
yeah.
Um,
Because you wrote like let's because there's a few things kind of like that are on the table that we wanted to talk about. Like one was, I'm going in my channel, I'm reading through the questions concern or the basic questions of philosophy by Heidegger.
philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, and and you just got done reading that, I believe, right? And then there's also an article that I read about a month ago, again by Ivo De Janeiro about the same. This thing he calls the same, um, and then I passed along to you the Rosen book, right? So there's those three things kind of in our midst to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about a good segue from the other topic that we just started with, namely kind of so what is technology doing?
Yeah,
It's disrupting because whenever when it's disrupting speech,
yeah,
that's I would put that forth to you. Because again, when I want to learn something, I do not go to my grandfather and then have a dialogue with him and he explains it to me in my native tongue. But
yeah,
I'm going online and look for some video. And I can also, there's no interaction there. The interaction is kind of hierarchical.
Yeah.
The child cannot really interact with the
Yeah.
the YouTube thing.
Yeah.
Cannot really ask questions. Maybe you can, but I mean, I know hardly anyone who really writes questions on YouTube
Yeah.
and then really gets an answer from the person who created this.
Yeah.
Also all these dialogue, all these things that so embodied,
Mm.
what can go on in a dialogue, all of that is not there. It's just this disembodied speech, and
Yeah.
also not really vis-a-vis like equal interaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so all of this is disrupted, and then this is insofar interesting because at the same time we have a surge, I would say, in therapy. And one of the key elements of the meaning crisis, as John Vervaeke argues, is the restoration of dialogue in our culture.
Yeah.
Because we can't even have real dialogue in our culture anymore on a grander scale, which is also then reflected by this culture war.
Yeah.
The fact that whenever we talk, we are all very vulnerable. We don't want to really share much. When it gets too political, we all feel irritated.
Right. Right.
And I'm for example, I'm very anxious to discuss certain topics with people because I'm afraid that but all difficult topics are triggering in some sense.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just the nature of dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, for Plato, I would say what's true for Plato is that Plato, for Plato, all so one of the key elements of dialectic is that when Plato was discussing something, they were going through all possible perspectives
Mm.
on that issue that's at hand.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they were not saying, "Oh, I have proposition A and that's it," but then they were also, "Okay, what's the counter proposition? And now let's go through this." And they were going through all of this
Yeah.
and setting also these propositions in tension,
Yeah.
which is also the word for diabolane. Diabolane means so bolos means to throw, so putting against each other, throwing against each other,
Yeah.
um, kind of propositions and perspectives in order to generate insight.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the Socratic elenkos is not destructive or negative, but is really just a way to generate insight.
Yeah.
Also, even if I disagree with your opinion,
Mhm.
my, let's say, repeating it and trying to understand your perspective is also a way for me to learn something and again to generate insight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and this is in some sense the way this is the way now the way but I mean the way then this kind of dialogus really becomes powerful, or this dialectic becomes powerful if it becomes dialogical,
Yeah.
and that works through dialogical friendship.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's how this very confrontative process,
Yeah.
which I just tried to outline, then really can become fruitful
Yeah. Yes.
if there is a kind of mutual agreement and respect in between the participants of the dialogue.
Yes. Totally. Totally.
Um, we can go then to Heidegger, and I think that's enough for the beginning.
Well, also the thing about too that I really liked and the way Rosen broke this down, like where because basically Rosen is in some sense he's trying to show how both Nietzsche and Heidegger are trying to get out of this two worlds mythology, right? Like, and that and that Nietzsche does it by just reversing Platonism, right? And that Heidegger does it by who actually distinguishes the one who really distinguishes, right, the way Nietzsche got it kind of wrong, or was given by, he's the ultimate epitome of the two worlds mythology, right? He just reverses it. But I think Rosen kind of shows with Heidegger that in some sense he's still in some way given by it, because he just simply negates the ineffable. He negates the eternal, and then tries to describe everything through a temporal frame, right? And here's the thing about here's the one thing I'm going to say about that is like that that I think Rosen, and a lot of times, as far as I can tell, Rosen, everything that Rosen is referencing about Heidegger in that book, it all comes from the 30s, right? Like in the 30s was a fucking strange time, right, for Heidegger, a really strange time. But
Yeah.
I don't think it's an ultimate statement about Heidegger's project, but I think it points to something that definitely was true for him, at least for that period of time, right?
Yeah, I must say I read it and I found myself, I was more sympathetic with his discussion on Plato.
Yep. Yep.
Um, I was not following, like, not following, I was just not agreeing with what he wrote about Heidegger in parts.
Yeah.
Um, be that as it may, I mean, this is like a big discussion.
Yeah. It's usually.
Um, this is a big discussion with a lot of aspects to it. I mean, I can outline a few of those if you want.
Yeah.
I would, however, want to stick to Heidegger's treatment of the nature of dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's
So,
do that.
for example, in the dialogue, in the colloquy, however we want to call it, with the Japanese.
Mhm.
I mean, he has some really nice phrases there where the Heidegger tries to really outline for him what an achieved colloquy actually means.
Yeah.
There's, for example, one sentence that's also in Ivo's paper, if I do not
If you're
misremember.
familiar with the terminology, you could roughly say colloquy is this other way that dialogue can be, right? What we
Yeah.
normally call dialogue, right? A
Um,
colloquy is another. It's a phrase that starts to get at this other way that could be.
yeah. So for so the Japanese and Heidegger in this dialogue say that an achieved colloquy, or it's actually the Japanese talking, and he says that for them as Japanese people, it's not strange or weird to shelter back what is talked about, so the issue, into the Ivo calls this, I think, the nondescript in the paper.
Yeah.
So this kind of source,
Yeah.
which is then also the same. And achieved speaking is always be speaking that
Yeah.
same from which they both belong. Yeah. Um, Now, why was this so crucial for Heidegger to kind of, this is this is difficult because what Heidegger saw in his dialogues was with the Japanese or with the Chinese people was that they could speak very well in European languages with metaphysical concepts,
Hmm.
but that might have distorted
Yeah.
this for Heidegger. It has distorted what was actually the issue of the dialogue.
Hmm.
Namely, in this example, it was Iki, which is a kind of art. It's not East Asian art in general. It's a more Japanese art
Hmm.
movement in from the Edo period. Um, we don't have to go into this in detail, But Heidegger noticed that the metaphysical concepts, the richness also of the European languages, was then, however, distorting what was said or what was the topic of the dialogue.
Yeah. 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 Totally. Totally.
And that is a problem insofar as then we have to be very careful what we say. For
Yeah.
example, when we refer to, even in a dialectical process, if we refer to words as God
Yep.
or ground of being or anything that's remotely from our tradition,
Yeah.
what we would have to do if we would take it serious, we would have to find some, we would have to, for each word, we would have to ask the East Asians, in your tradition, do you have something that comes close to this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
we would have to clarify all the words, which
Yeah.
is huge work, you know. And the Greeks didn't have this problem because there was just Greek
Yeah.
language. There was no other language. There was just Greek. There was no need for translation or anything. There was just Greek. Um, so they didn't have this problem 2,500 years ago. Um, but for us, this is a very delicate problem.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Now, what Rosen says, let's stop here. And do you have anything to
Yeah.
say on this?
That way, just that way that you're talking about, that in some sense, the Japanese had this way of, in fact, just quoting, I think um, one of the things that Heidegger and the Japanese philosopher in that dialogue that they had together, they talked about, like, we Japanese don't find it strange, um, to for the undefinable, to return things back to the keeping of the undefinable, right? And Heidegger goes on and says, yeah, in this way, oh god, I can't remember, like, the exact quote, but, like, not only do we keep in safekeeping the undefinable, that which cannot be defined can grow ever more luminously.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
This kind of sense, and I remember with my sense was what Eva was kind of drawing out there, or thinking further, right, was this vague source, right? That there is this kind of way of of presencing the vague, right, and sheltering the vague, right, as the source of what is to be talked about, in a way that doesn't clarify it and thus change it into something other than the vague, right? This it's a very careful. I mean, it's a very careful, like, minding
Yeah, yeah,
of what is spoken, because you're speaking with this kind of eye on not getting clear about something, right? Like, I think that's the thing. That's the thing that's really, really kind of different here, is where normally you think of dialogue, I'm speaking because I'm attempting to say something, and the saying of which will clarify what we're talking about, or the issue that we're talking about. But this is the kind of speaking that's like, it's actually trying to draw out in presence what cannot be clarified, yet tend to it in a way that reveals it, right? But also um, uh, shelters it in its authenticity, if you will.
yeah. And I would I would now argue that in Plato, which in Evo's text, this is now called the an unhypothetical same,
Yeah,
is also always present.
yeah,
And but it's always looming somewhere in the background, but it's there in all the dialogues.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, totally.
In all the questions, in all the explorations, in all the digressions also.
Yeah.
Because there are many digressions in all of Plato's dialogues. But
Yeah.
the and any hypothesis is just generated to, again, further clarify but also shelter this unhypothetical saying,
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
which can and in any hypothesis is just a springboard so we can interrogate it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but they're not grounded.
Yeah.
Finally, not it's that, because then it becomes a ground again. And I think Socrates and Plato were very aware of this.
Yes.
But that it can sway in its mysteriousness.
Yeah. Yes. Totally. Yeah. This is very much. I mean, this very much just strikes me as, it's usually in the dialogue. This is where, Socrates stops talking and then he starts, I don't know, like doing something that exemplifies the thing he's talking about, but then stops like he stops saying anything, right? In some sense,
Yeah,
where the drama of what's happening is exemplifying that which is presencing, which is, yeah, precisely this kind of inexhaustible, um, ineffable, right, sense
yeah,
of the always
yeah,
withdrawn, right? And so in so many different ways, it's like that's the essence of the Socratic irony, right? It's
yeah,
like we do all this stuff, we clarify all these positions, we go in this dialogue, and at the end of it, like no one can say anything about it. Yep, everyone wants to hang out with Socrates, right?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Or have sex with him as Alcibiades
yes,
once.
yes, yes. Everyone wants to, yeah, have sex with the most unattractive Socrates.
um, where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, I mean, one of the things I was going to say that I really liked about Rosen, and when he starts talking about the good, um, like it was the clarity that he just kind of articulated, right? This, um, you could say dilemma, you could say paradox of being a human being, right? Speaking into the Republic in some sense, like, their starting point is to talk about opinions, right? That's the entry point, right? Because opinions start to get at and clarifying those opinions and seeing those opinions, right? And then asking what the truth is and all of that. Right? Rosen does this really clarifying thing where he talks about that, and I don't know if I can do it any justice, right? Because um, I'll probably botch this up, but basically, to be a human being is to be in this tension between speech and desire, right? And like, um, in that when you look at it, it's like you usually think about desire. The thing that I desire is not being about speech, right? It's like, but actually, you can only have what you can speak, right? So the whole thing about speech is you want to get your speech to most optimally realize the deepest desire, what you most deepest desire, right? So that you can have what you most want, right? And that, and it's this interplay between desire and speech that you're constantly between. But then he kind of goes into it and he says, like, well, this is the tension though, because to be a human being, right, is to desire perfection, essentially, right? Is to desire the good in itself. Yet if we realize that desire, right, and we quench that desire, then we stop being human beings, right? We eliminate ourselves, right? And if we go totally into speech, right, we end up talking in silence, right? If it's not revealing that desire. so it's the human being is in this strange position where it's trying to get as close to perfection as possible while keeping a distance from, right, keeping a distance from perfection as possible, right? But trying to get close. So it's this kind of nearness at a distance that we're constantly, which in some sense, the polis ideally is this forum that in philosophy is this way of continually interacting these two things, right? And in, in the way that Vervaeke's been really emphasizing as of late, right? This kind of, it's this ideal point between where the horizontal and the vertical really meet, right? But it's a constant activity. It's more like music. It's like there's a certain tempo, right, where you hit that sweet spot. You're constantly bringing this tension between what's above and below, right? And that's happening through this desire and speech and being a human being. But it always has to renew itself. You never just have it, right? And in that way, the ineffable and the immanent and the transcendent are constantly in tension with each other, right? In creative tension with each other.
Yeah.
And I thought that,
This, right?
yeah,
With the fingers, which
exactly.
unfortunately I've not here, but
Yeah,
there's this painting with the fingers that just barely touch,
yeah,
but anyone who observes it, there's just so much going on in between the two fingers.
yes, yes, totally. And that the dialectic, right, you could say is the way, right, of doing that, right? But there's kind of this element of like where, in so many of the dialogues kind of bottom out in aporia, right? Because this aporia kind of it's this weird sense where the thing that you most want to get close with, like the closer you get to it, the further away it becomes, right? And
Yeah.
and that and that's kind of what the dialogues are enacting in some way. So I think Rosen's conclusion I think is pretty astute, right? That the critique of Platonicism, right, isn't really a critique of Plato, right? You can't in a lot of the third wave, like the third wave Platonism, and this is what's ironic about it, right? Because in some sense, Heidegger puts it all on Plato, right? But actually, he puts it on Platonicism, right? The development of Platonicism through the years kind of separates these things of like the transcendent from the immanent as two separate domains, right? And you have the two worlds of mythology, so where they're in opposition versus in tension, right? And you can see philosophy trying to work that out, and then yet what's really interesting is you couldn't have third wave Platonicism, right? That goes back in and sees that mistake in understanding Plato, and in some sense sees more of what he's actually doing, which is Plato isn't talking about a two worlds mythology, right? At all. And but it but if it wasn't for Heidegger, you couldn't have third wave Platonism, right? It's like, I just think it's so ironic, right? That like, yeah, okay, so Heidegger kind of misinterprets Plato, right? But in some sense, the thinking that ensues from that is what the third wave Platonists kind of pick up and then look right back into Platonism and are able to see that mistake and see through it in some sense. I just think that whole thing's kind of really fascinating to me.
Yeah. uh, yeah. And just one comment on when I think about what is written in the dialogue with the Japanese, and it's also about sheltering back the vertical and the horizontal so they can sway freely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
a thing can be in its suchness, and the off ground can be in its moreness, ever withdrawing but ever clearing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the mystery is always safeguarded. That's and it might also be something like aporia, maybe.
Yeah.
It might also be something, we've said it all, we can go home.
Yeah.
uh, we are not the mystery doesn't overwhelm us.
Yeah.
And there are these strange, right? There are these strange. Sometimes we end on the dialogues, and of course we haven't figured everything out.
Yeah.
But it's there's this feeling
Hmm.
we've delved deeper into the stratas or the realm of intelligibility,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we got somehow we were able to participate finitely with the infinite.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And there's a strange intuition in the human being when that happens,
Yeah.
and that's realizing that in this twofold sense that John or Nishitani talk about, that gives us so much meaning, right? Then sense is there.
Right. Right.
And the human being, right? The task of the human being is always to find again the avenue towards that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of finite, that finite
Yeah,
transcendence.
yeah, 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 yeah. Um, I also liked how you summarized the book. I think that was very good
Oh, good.
for our dialogue here.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
We could not talk a little bit about his criticism of Heidegger.
Yeah, I'd love to.
I because I mean he gives Rosen gives a major accusation of Heidegger.
Yeah.
Actually, a couple, right? So the first is that Nietzsche and Heidegger um, go too much into historicity,
Mm-hmm.
and then we would have to. I do not think Rosen really got what Heidegger thought of
History.
his
His,
kind of the weirdness of being,
yeah.
um,
Yeah.
because what Heidegger tried to show is that the principle of principles, so to
Yeah.
say, has shown itself always in different modalities,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like the idea of the good, and then maybe like subjectivity or the will to power, and then with that also is that the just the occurrence of how things are biding, showing themselves to us, that also changes.
Yeah.
Things aren't always the same.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is like the most important thing. Things aren't always the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
They in the way they show themselves to us,
Yeah.
there are turnings.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's kind of then this issue with art, poetry, because art and poetry can help to illuminate, let's say, the truth of beings,
Yeah. Yeah.
and presence the truth of beings in the midst of beings, so to say, that they are clearing of being in beings. That's the work of art, so to say.
Right. 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 Right.
And that's why I also then disagree with his analysis of Heidegger's very what's the word, his very strange way of talking. So he makes this criticism at the very beginning. He even cites something in German, and then he says, I don't even translate it because it sounds like gibberish or something. Heidegger is always, as the title of his book, he's always on the way to language, to this withdrawn source.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So he's just trying to learn from poets like Hölderlin,
Yeah.
um, or other
Yeah.
poets, in order to how can I speak in such a way that the mystery of this source is guarded in speech.
Yeah.
So he's
Totally.
always constantly on the way to language, constantly. And I think there his equation with this very strange speech and then silence, which is kind of like ending up in a place of like aporia.
Yeah.
And when you end up in aporia, then it's not nihilism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like if you end up in aporia and
Yeah.
that's really nihilism, because then you just admit that you're clueless and powerless. That's not really, and you
Yeah.
have no knowledge. So
Yeah.
that's not a way. That's not a way out. But
Yeah.
Heidegger constantly tries to be on the way to language.
Totally. Totally. And so
Um,
is it what you're saying? Like, you think one of the ways Rosen misunderstands Heidegger is that he reads all of that and he abstracts or projects views that Heidegger has, like views that
yeah,
conclusions that he's made, right? Where you're saying that that's not actually what Heidegger isn't concerned with having viewpoints or idea, but just simply being always on the way, right?
yeah. And in this, Heidegger has this strange soliloquy with the same or with being itself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
um, and just trying, he's always like a poet is. They are just on the way to that in their repeated attempts of saying the same
yeah,
over and over and over again.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
that I think needs to be acknowledged.
yeah, yeah. Okay,
What this attempt is actually about.
yeah, yeah,
Now from that you can say, okay, maybe it's better not to be in this soliloquy with being itself,
yeah,
but let's have a dialogue about it. Let's practice dialectic into dialogos.
yeah,
But I think Heidegger did that. I mean, Heidegger always had dialogues with all sorts of people.
yeah.
And I think it's exemplified what he has in mind in this dialogue with the Japanese.
Right, right, right. Totally, totally.
Um,
Yeah,
so what's the other point I wanted to say? Yeah, with historicity, it's just, I think that, I mean, there Heidegger committed a blunder, right? When in this 1 year where he really thought that the Nazis
hmm,
are right, that there's, because that's the danger that Rosen points out, and I
yeah,
think that has some validity given what happened.
yeah,
If any philosopher really falls to the temptation to identify one contingent element of history
yeah,
with let's say the happenings of being, that's dangerous,
yeah,
right? Then you can fall into idolatry. And
yeah,
I think that's why, then later Heidegger really makes clear in all of his writings and makes the separation between history and what he calls the history of being, Seinsgeschichte,
yeah,
what Evo translates as the weirdness of being.
yeah,
Really pointing to a different level here, namely the level of being itself.
yeah, yeah. Totally, totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, what? Yeah, I have some. I'm glad we're talking about because I have some questions about this because I mean, what I think Rosen is saying, or his criticism, right, is so this claim that basically like Heidegger tries to break free of the two worlds mythology, right, um, and of Nietzsche, right, by in some sense negating the eternal, right? like negating the eternal. And what that looks like is, and what he's trying to say is something like, um, Heidegger's he's saying he's kind of saying that like what's got all of our attention on some level is the what of things, right? Is what they are, and but the thing that's really concealed is that they are, right? They're, in some senses that thing that you go when you go that, right? And Heidegger's kind of going like, well, that, right? That, and then kind of pointing to that. What are we pointing to when we point to the ultimate that being, right? Like it's none of the things that we can kind of point out, right? And he says that, I think he's saying that like Heidegger is trying to he in some sense separates, he, he he's trying to get this that Western metaphysics is the progression of the forgetfulness, right? Of basically assuming that that is a what, right? Is a what of some kind, and then trying to explain everything in relationship to that. And that Heidegger goes, I think that, and it's basically, God, I don't know if I'm actually articulating this correctly, but like that essentially Rosen kind of points out that you can't separate um, the what from the that. And Heidegger kind of separates that on some level, right? That like you actually can't have a what without a that and a that without a what. And in that sense, they're in polarity, but they're not polarized, right? And so some of Heidegger's project, and in some sense, is trying to restore the that or bring it out into unconcealment, but implicitly separates them, and therefore repeats the division in some sense.
I think in Principles of Philosophy, Ivo writes that in Parmenides, the unity of what and that is still there.
Yeah.
And that the argument from this side would be that in Plato, it gets a little bit separated because of the question, what is the beingness of beings?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then shifting the focus a little bit more towards beings.
Yeah.
And then providing the needed ground for beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
The kind of stable ground for beings.
Right. Right.
The whole thing with the eternal is this thing that this kind of seeing again through different positions in metaphysics, and you can legitimately ask the question like, why are there different positions on that? If it's eternal, if it's really eternal, why is it not just one thing and it's always the same?
Yeah.
And I think after the death of God, I mean that really becomes a huge problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because this is so what Heidegger I think tries to show is that there is this kind of principle of principles, which is itself never a thing, but it's somehow it has inner turns and gives rise to different inceptions.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Which are then articulated in a different way by different thinkers who are minding this principle of principles.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. Yeah.
And this leads him then again not in the dimension really of contingent history. And I said again, this was I mean it was the blunder of Heidegger, but this is why so many scholars have great hesitation about him in acknowledging him, not identifying with any contingent historical fact like the Nazi regime, but then with something that's, Heidegger wouldn't say transcended, but that belongs to the realm of being itself.
Yeah. 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 Totally. Totally.
The twofold, by the way, I mean, if you remember the dialogue with the Japanese, he talks about the twofold.
Hmm. Hmm.
The
Yeah.
twofold of, and that this is also a strange thing, being and beings are kind of connected in this twofoldness.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And the one thing is they're kind of they're abiding, they're kind of their verbal, which in the metaphysical tradition was called becoming,
Yeah.
and then being on the other hand.
Right.
The
Okay.
being and instead Heidegger, I think, doesn't try to hypothesize
Hmm.
being or becoming into these two pillars.
Yeah.
Here's being, here's becoming,
Yeah.
and we have two worlds, but showing that this twofold is much more interrelated in ways we don't understand, and
Yeah.
which then this becomes then the task of thinking and of philosophy,
Yeah. Yeah.
understanding, still trying to understand how these two things interrelate.
Yeah.
Because what Heidegger is definitely not up to is just saying, he's just saying that there is a principle
Yeah.
and it's not a thing. And this is still the mystery.
Yeah.
Now, so metaphysics for him is just,
Yeah.
when he says Platonism is metaphysics and that is nihilism, he just says that this no thingy element has not been thought of in its own right.
Yeah. 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 Totally.
So and that is now our task, to think it in its own right,
Yeah. Yeah.
being qua nothingness,
Yeah.
just that.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, got it. Because see, it's like it's so interesting because I always in reading Heidegger, touching on it, I always just assumed some kind of he's talking about some kind of, I guess, a transcendent, ineffable something or other, right? That like,
He does. I
yeah,
mean, he says being he says in Being and Time, being is the 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 utmost transcendence or transcendent or something. I don't
totally.
know exactly how it's in weirdness of being in right at the beginning, where,
Yeah.
pretty much at the beginning, if you
And
want
so,
to read it.
and even this, the attempt or what's being called for here is to speak, um, being qua being, like just to basically mind this principle, right? That we don't totally understand. To mind it, right? In some sense, is kind of is this. It sounds to me very much this sense of like the transcendent and the immanent coming together there. Like that's the to bring it into some kind of language, right? That
Yeah,
preserves it in its own element, right? Like to me, this
yeah.
sounds much like the the higher and the
It
lower coming together,
it
right?
is this. It is this now, but now we have to be very, very cautious, because when we talk about immanence and transcendence, we're using the language of metaphysics.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
this has become problematic. This is this whole thing that became so clear to Heidegger when he talked with the Japanese people.
yeah. Got you.
So we can't say immanence, we can't say transcendence. We have to ask, what do you say for do
Right,
you understand what we mean here? And
right.
then he says in the dialogue, okay, I have the Heart Sutra in mind, where it says, without, he says, color, it's shiki in Japanese.
Yeah,
There's no ku. And then he says, what is this? It's the open, it's the sky, and then Heidegger says, oh, this sounds similar to what Plato said about aesthesis and noesis. And then
yeah.
and then they say, yeah, it's similar, but it's also not so similar. So
Right.
I would just emphasize that, um, this has to do then with reason, reason.
Yeah,
Reason likes to jump on these concepts and use them,
yeah,
but we
yeah.
always have to be very mindful of the concepts we're using.
Right, right.
um And then again, Heidegger is just trying to find a way. Is there maybe a more original way to talk about
Yeah,
these things? These
yeah,
so, and
yeah.
again, in any dialogue, we would have to really clarify all of these things. They're
Totally.
just they're very present at hand, I would say, for our Western understanding.
Yeah, but there can be a grave mistake and just grabbing it unthinkingly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, totally. That interesting. Interesting.
Because whenever you say this, then you might, there might be the assumption, okay, this is also the same language that Christian theology uses.
Yeah, yeah,
Do
yeah,
we believe in a Christian God, or do we try to have a dialogue, I don't know, with Buddhists
yeah, yeah,
who talk about all of this in a very different way, or with Taoists, or who knows with whom.
yeah.
So that's I think the danger in all of this, and one that one should always be mindful of that.
Totally, totally. Next time I have to get going, but next time we should talk about Unaris because that's
But
you know
what?
he's an Orthodox philosopher, theologian, one of the most prolific ones in modern time, but where he basically kind of really takes up Heidegger in a big way. And in so,
I think you have to send me something.
yeah,
I have not. I have no idea who that is,
yeah,
but
I'll send you some things. But I think he's doing something. I think Yanaris is doing something that I don't very unusual in this that I think is striking. But he's not that. He's only recently been translated in English for not that long, so he's not very well known in like English speaking world. But yeah, let's maybe I'll send you some things and then we can talk about it. Awesome.
okay. Bye.
Seeing
Bye
you.
bye.